a fire on Lexington Avenue, a forged note, and a family whose respectability burns faster than the truth it hides. In this story, intellect meets vanity, and justice wears the mask of civility. Within the quiet rooms of a New York brownstone, a single mind dissects pride, deceit, and the price of reputation, with precision sharper than any blade. Before we begin, I'd love to know where in the world you're tuning in from and what time it is for you right now. Let me know in the comments. Settle in, because this mystery begins now. You could have set your watch by Wolfe's mornings. 9 o'clock meant orchids, 10 meant beer, and 10:30 meant any living creature foolish enough to interrupt the sacred sequence would be banished from the premises. I was the living creature that day. The phone had already rung 3 times before I even dared to carry in the morning mail. A dozen callers wanted 5 minutes of Mr. Wolfe's attention. None would get 5 seconds. My own boredom was breeding sarcasm by the minute. Fritz, rattling pans in the kitchen, hummed something in German that probably translated to "patience is a virtue," but it was wasted on me. Upstairs, Wolfe was in his orchid rooms, communing with plants that gave him more satisfaction than people ever did. At precisely 10, he came down, immaculate as ever, carrying the air of a man whose soul had never known hurry. "Archie," he said, eyeing the pile of messages, "the world insists on intruding." "It's got nerve," I told him. "There's one woman who's called twice, name's Carrington, says it's urgent." He grunted, a sound halfway between contempt and digestion. "Then let her stew," he said, reaching for his beer. It was the calm before intrusion, and I didn't know it yet. By the 3rd call, my curiosity had outgrown my boredom. I dropped the name like a pebble into still water. "She's a Miss Lydia Carrington, Lexington Avenue address. Old money, I'd bet my tie on it." That got him. Wolfe's eyes, which usually regarded humanity as an unfortunate botanical offshoot, flicked open. "Carrington," he repeated slowly, tasting the syllables. "That family once furnished a mayor, 2 bankrupts, and a collector of illuminated manuscripts." "Quite the resume," I said. "Shall I tell her you're allergic to trouble, or just to callers?" He lifted a finger, not for my benefit, but for his own logic. "I will see her at 11. I didn't grin, but I wanted to. The trick with Wolfe was never to show satisfaction when you got him interested. It spoiled his dignity. "Sure," I said. "I'll call the lady. But for a man who claims indifference, you just rescheduled your orchids." He poured another inch of beer, unbothered. "Mr. Goodwin, curiosity is not indulgence. It is hygiene for the mind." That's how it always began, with hygiene, and ended with homicide. At 11 sharp, she arrived, slender, elegant, wrapped in grey silk that looked expensive enough to apologize for her nerves. Miss Lydia Carrington had the composure of a woman raised among portraits and obligations, but her eyes betrayed the strain of something far less polished. I ushered her into the office, and Wolfe barely inclined his head. He preferred clients to speak before he decided if they existed. "My uncle," she began, her voice thin at the edges, "died last week at Lexington House. They say it was suicide." Wolfe closed his eyes as if she'd interrupted a symphony. "And you doubt it, of course." "I know it," she said, the tremor barely under control. "He left no reason. No illness, no debts. Only a note, typed, and a signature that wasn't his." That got my attention. The air in the room tightened a notch. She folded her gloved hands. "They called it despair. But my uncle was many things. Vain, yes, but not despairing." Her tone had that brittle composure rich families wear like armor. Wolfe opened his eyes again, considering her as if she were an orchid that might bloom under pressure. I already knew this one wasn't routine. When she left, Wolfe leaned back, forming a small dome with his fingertips. "Another sentimental fool," he said. "Grief seeks conspiracy." I wasn't convinced. There had been a tremor in Lydia's voice that didn't sound rehearsed. Maybe, I said, but she didn't come here to rent sympathy. She came because something's off. He eyed me without moving. Your intuition is not evidence, Archie. It is enthusiasm dressed as logic. Sure, I said, but I've seen that look before. The kind that means she's holding something back. And people don't get that scared over imagination. He grunted. Then let her keep her secrets. They cost nothing. Maybe so, but her hands had shaken when she mentioned the note. I'd seen fear before, and it never wore silk gloves for long. I didn't press Wolfe further, but the silence between us had the shape of a question neither of us wanted to answer yet. The next morning, she was back. I brought her in, and Wolfe didn't bother to hide his annoyance, but Lydia wasn't the kind to flinch twice. There's something I didn't mention, she said. The police missed it. My uncle's silver letter opener, the one shaped like a lion, it's gone. That did it. Wolfe's head lifted, eyes narrowing the way they do when he smells a motive hiding under manners. Describe it, he said. Silver, heavy, engraved with the family crest. He kept it on his desk. It vanished the night he died. I watched Wolfe's expression shift, just a fraction, but enough. The lion had caught his attention. He rose, which for Wolfe was as rare as an eclipse. Miss Carrington, he said, his voice suddenly alive. A lion without claws is an anomaly I cannot ignore. Lydia exhaled as if permission had been granted. I just nodded to myself, routine officially, over. And something told me this lion was going to bite. Lexington House didn't so much sit on its lot as brood there. The dusk had settled heavy, the kind that turns polished stone into melancholy. When I walked up the drive, the air smelled of lilacs and money long since spent. A butler opened the door with the expression of a man accustomed to apologies, though I hadn't offered one yet. Inside, the place was an exhibit in arrested decay, gilded frames, stiff furniture, and silence padded thick enough to trip on. I had the feeling every carpet had absorbed more secrets than footsteps. Servants moved through the hall like trained shadows, polite enough to be unnerving. The portraits along the staircase watched me climb, each ancestor looking more disappointed than the last. By the time I reached the drawing room, I knew Wolfe had been right about one thing. Manners can be the most efficient form of camouflage. A tall man waited near the fireplace, his stance immaculate, his welcome measured. He introduced himself as Victor Carrington, the heir of the house. His handshake was brisk, his eyes colder than the marble mantel behind him. He gestured toward a chair. I sat, already guessing that grief wasn't the only ghost in this mansion. Victor had the voice of a man who practiced sincerity in mirrors. My uncle was a proud man, he said, pacing in small, graceful steps. The shame of that scandal, well, it destroyed him. What scandal? I asked. He blinked, just slow enough to rehearse. A matter of business. Irrelevant now. Funny, I said. Suicides usually make everything relevant. He smiled, the polite kind that shows no teeth. Your employer enjoys probing the private grief of families? Only when invited, I said, and only when the grief smells rehearsed. That got a flicker. A muscle near his jaw betrayed him. You'll find, he said, that my uncle's affairs were entirely respectable. I'll take your word, I told him, but my boss won't. He likes his respectability verified in ink. Victor's eyes tightened. Ink? Lexington blue, if he can get it, I said lightly, watching him flinch before he turned away. He poured himself a drink, steadying the glass a moment too long. The sound of crystal against crystal was the only confession I needed, for now. When the butler announced the family lawyer's arrival, Victor looked relieved enough to be guilty. Mr. Dalrymple entered like a legal clause in human form, precise, humorless, and written in fine print. Trailing him was Margaret Vale, Victor's fiancée, a woman whose charm had been sharpened for social fencing. Dalrymple shook my hand with professional reluctance. I trust this visit is brief, Mr. Goodwin. I trust the truth won't take long, I said. Margaret smiled. Truth is such a heavy word, isn't it? We prefer peace. It was a duet, his restraint, her grace. Between them, I could almost hear the pages of a script turning. Victor stood by the window, arms crossed, playing the part of the noble mourner. Dalrymple spoke of legalities, Margaret of loss, each detail polished until it gleamed too perfectly. I nodded, made notes I didn't need, and thought of Wolfe's dictum. Perfection is a lie's favourite disguise. When Margaret finally asked if I'd like tea, I smiled. Not unless it's brewed with honesty. That ended the concert. The late Mr. Carrington's study had the antiseptic cleanliness of a stage after the play's final act. Everything gleamed, except the truth. A mahogany desk sat squarely beneath a portrait of a lion crest, the same one Lydia had mentioned. The blotter was pristine except for one peculiar smudge of blue ink, rich and metallic, Lexington blue. The pen beside it was dry, the nib fractured as if bitten by impatience. I leaned closer. On the blotter's edge was a faint impression of a signature, too slanted for suicide, too confident for despair. I slipped Lydia's letter from my pocket. The tint matched perfectly. Behind me, the air felt thicker, the kind of silence that grows ears. A servant coughed in the hallway, and I knew I wasn't supposed to linger. I jotted mental notes, a forged note, missing letter opener, and ink that had travelled from this desk to Wolfe's orchids by way of a frightened niece. The room smelled of polish and deceit. When I turned to leave, a draught nudged the curtains just enough to reveal the outline of a burn mark on the rug, small, circular, deliberate. It wasn't much, but Wolfe once said, "No fire starts without vanity striking the match." I was halfway down the corridor when a voice hissed from the shadows. "Sir, wait!" A maid, small, anxious, the kind that's been trained to be invisible, darted toward me. Her fingers twisted the edge of her apron like she was trying to strangle her courage. "I shouldn't speak," she whispered. "But someone was in the study that night, after midnight." "Who?" I asked. She shook her head. "I only heard footsteps and the drawer close. Then, nothing." Her eyes darted toward the staircase. "Please, don't." She froze. Mr. Dalrymple was standing at the far end of the hall, his tone dry as law. "Mr. Goodwin, are you interrogating the staff now?" "Just complimenting the housekeeping," I said, offering a grin I didn't mean. "This place could pass for a museum." He didn't smile back. "See that it remains one." The maid slipped away, vanishing into servant territory. I tipped my hat to Dalrymple and walked toward the front door, already feeling Wolfe's curiosity sharpening like a knife. The house had given me its first whisper, and if I knew Wolfe, he'd turn it into a confession before breakfast. When Wolfe called something a theatre of motive, it usually meant I'd be the usher, ticket taker, and janitor. He was leaning back in the office chair, fingers steepled, looking smug enough to own Broadway. "You will attend this dinner, Archie," he said. "Lexington House will host a performance of human vanity under the guise of civility. Observe carefully. Appetite reveals more than confession." I gave him a look. "I've seen plenty of appetite, usually mine." He ignored that. "You are to eat, listen, and return with the sequence of conversation as precisely as if it were testimony." "Fine," I said. "But if the caviar talks back, I'm sending it to you." Wolfe's lips twitched, the kind of micro-expression that meant he'd already decided I'd be miserable and he'd enjoy the report. "Goodwin, even farce can instruct." I grabbed my hat, knowing full well I was the farce. He'd stay here with beer and Fritz's lamb roast while I dined on tension and polite venom. As I left, he called after me, "Remember, Archie, every dinner table is a confessional, only with better silverware." It sounded clever. It didn't sound appetizing. By the time I arrived at Lexington House, the place had the glow of money trying to forget it was nervous. Candlelight softened the edges of polished gilt, and the dining table stretched like a battlefield disguised with linen. Victor Carrington rose to greet me, all manners and ice. Margaret Vale gave me a smile polished enough to blind truth. Lydia sat at the far end, her eyes on her plate like she was watching something sink. Conversation began the way polite combat does. Small talk, loaded with sharp ammunition. The soup arrived, so did tension. Victor praised the stock market's recovery with the conviction of a man who'd never met one. Margaret corrected him gently, her tone dipped in honey and arsenic. I focused on my fork and the silence between sentences. There was no warmth, no grief, just the slow unraveling of family courtesy. Even the servants moved too quietly, as if afraid to disturb the lies floating over the table. Halfway through the roast, I realized Wolfe was right. This wasn't dinner. It was evidence served à la carte. And from the way Victor's hand shook when Margaret mentioned the will, dessert was going to be explosive. It happened over the second glass of wine. Margaret, with the poise of a stage actress delivering her favourite line, said, "It's such a shame about the codicil, all that rewriting for nothing." Victor froze, fork suspended. "What codicil? The one your uncle destroyed before he... well." She let the pause dangle like perfume. The temperature at that table dropped 10 degrees. Lydia pushed her plate aside and rose, pale as parchment. "Excuse me," she whispered, and left the room before anyone breathed again. Victor turned to Margaret, jaw tight. "You shouldn't have mentioned that." "Shouldn't I?" she said, smiling. It was hardly a secret. The lawyer, Dalrymple, coughed discreetly, as if clearing away the truth. The conversation collapsed into small noises, the clink of a spoon, the scrape of a chair, the faint sound of someone lying beautifully. I watched the pieces fall into place. A destroyed codicil meant a motive freshly varnished. Wolfe would call it an appetizing development. I called it trouble in silk. And by the look on Victor's face, I wasn't the only one who'd lost his appetite. After dinner, the air needed thinning. I found Dalrymple in the smoking room, polishing a cigar he had no intention of lighting. "Quite a meal," I said. "I've seen quieter riots." He adjusted his glasses. "Family discussions can be spirited." "Sure, especially about unsigned codicils." He stiffened, then managed a chuckle that belonged in a courtroom transcript. "There was no signed document, Mr. Goodwin. None at all." "That's convenient." He glanced toward the doorway, then back at me. "I don't expect you to understand matters of probate." "Probably not," I said. "But I know a liar when I smell one, and this room's starting to get crowded." The vein at his temple pulsed once, a small confession. "Good evening," he said, brisk as a closing argument, and left before I could ask the next question. I made a note to tell Wolfe the lawyer's nerves had all the steadiness of a jello mold in an earthquake. I drifted toward the library on my way out, mostly to escape the scent of falsity and cologne. The place was a museum of dusted pride, rows of gilt spines and more family portraits glaring down from the walls. A faint glint near the corner shelf caught my eye. I reached for an antique novel, The Lion and the Fox. Between its yellowed pages rested the missing silver letter opener, its lion crest gleaming like it had just winked at me. No blood, no fingerprints, just a trace of that same Lexington blue ink at the handle's base. Someone had put it there carefully, not hidden, but displayed, an accusation waiting for applause. I held it a moment, feeling its weight, its smugness. Whoever planted it wanted Wolfe to find it, through me. I replaced the book exactly as I'd found it. There was no point in showing my hand yet. As I left, I could still feel the lion's grin at my back. If Wolfe called the dinner a theatre of motive, then this was the encore. Only the curtain hadn't fallen yet. Back at the brownstone, civilization had returned to its proper hierarchy. Wolfe ruling from his chair, Fritz at the stove, and me between them, armed with sarcasm. The air smelled of lamb kidneys, malt, and the faint peace that only comes after social catastrophe. I gave Wolfe the highlights of the Carrington soiree, from the veiled insults to the exposed nerves. He didn't interrupt, which meant he was either thinking deeply or drifting toward his first post-dinner trance. His eyelids hung halfway like Venetian blinds on a lazy day. "So," I said, finishing. "The evening was a triumph of manners over murder. You'd have been proud. Nobody died, though. A few egos were badly wounded." Wolfe's eyes opened, slow and deliberate. "Your levity, Archie, is unseemly in the presence of revelation." "Sure," I said, "but levity's cheaper than aspirin." He ignored that, which was his way of conceding the point. Fritz appeared with the beer tray, and domestic order reclaimed the world. For 10 minutes, there was only the sound of silverware and digestion. Then Wolfe spoke, and the investigation resumed over buttered toast. "It was," Wolfe said, setting down his fork, "a murder born of etiquette." I looked up. "That's poetic. You planning to publish in The Gentleman Detective?" His eyes narrowed. "Do not trivialize what you fail to grasp. Etiquette is the armor of deceit. In such houses, emotion must pass through formality before it can strike. The weapon is not steel, but decorum." "Fine," I said, "but you'll forgive me if I prefer pistols to place cards. At least one leaves fingerprints." He gave a grunt that might have been amusement. "Your irreverence blinds you, Archie. A man may kill without touching his victim if pride or protocol demand it. Observe how each Carrington behaves. Every smile is a defense, every courtesy a blade." I leaned back. "So you're saying the killer said, 'please' and 'thank you' while committing murder?" He nodded once. "Exactly. Manners conceal motive more efficiently than darkness." That was Wolfe for you. Turning dinner into philosophy, and philosophy into evidence. And I had the uneasy feeling he was right. Wolfe tapped his finger against the rim of his glass. "Your account, Archie, offers nothing remarkable, except tone." "Tone?" I asked. Lydia Carrington's poise was not grief but repression. Margaret Vale's composure was deliberate theatre. Victor Carrington's irritation, vanity in distress. I raised a brow. "You're profiling, not detecting." "Pfui," he said. "To understand motive, one must trace emotion, not chronology. Facts are static, feelings betray sequence." I finished my beer. "So you're telling me emotion leaves fingerprints?" "Precisely. And yours, if I may observe, show impatience." "Can't argue there," I said. "The only thing slower than this case is you explaining it." He smiled faintly. "Patience, Archie. We are nearing the fulcrum of folly." Which meant nothing to me, but Wolfe never translated his metaphors for the working class. Still, I caught the drift. He'd spotted a pattern beneath the manners, and knowing Wolfe, he'd let me chase it next. An hour later, he vanished upstairs, leaving me with paperwork and the dregs of logic. When he finally reappeared, he was carrying calm like a fresh orchid. The smell of humidity and plant food followed him, a domestic storm in a flower pot. He moved to the stand by the window, pruning shears in hand. "Ink and inheritance," he murmured. "Both stain easily." "Beautiful," I said. "Next you'll be composing haikus for the Times." He didn't look up. "Mockery is a defense of the unimaginative. I cultivate orchids for the same reason I pursue murder. Both expose decay concealed by beauty." "Sure," I said. "Only one smells better." That earned me a glare sharp enough to trim orchids without scissors. He clipped a petal, turned it in the light, and declared, "Corruption, Mr. Goodwin, is seldom ugly. It learns perfume." That was Wolfe, half Aristotle, half bulldozer. The silence that followed was comfortable, but not final. I could tell his next order was already germinating. He turned from the orchids abruptly, voice crisp again. "Archie, find the maid who handled Mr. Carrington's correspondence." I blinked. "That's sudden. You think she licked the envelope of guilt?" He ignored the humour. "She knows what the ink concealed. I set down my notepad. You mean the Lexington blue? Precisely, the hue that connects desk, forgery, and conscience. It is time we consult the hands that folded the truth. I was hoping for a quiet evening, I said. Maybe a movie, maybe not freezing on somebody's doorstep. Your leisure is subordinate to reason. That's what every employer says right before murder. He only raised an eyebrow. Find her, bring her, and for heaven's sake do not intimidate. She will speak only if fear is absent. I sighed, grabbed my coat, and muttered something unprintable about domestic tyranny. Behind me, Wolfe was already pouring another beer, his mind moving faster than the foam. And I knew the hunt was on again. When Wolfe sends me on a hunt, it's never for sport. He sits fat and comfortable in his chair while I pound the pavements, chasing ghosts with cab fares. That morning, the ghost had a name. Ruth Denham, former maid of Lexington House. It took 3 calls, 2 cab drivers, and 1 overpaid mail clerk to point me toward 10th Avenue, where the streetlights looked like they'd stopped believing in illumination. The boarding house sat between a pawn shop and a silence too thick to trust. Inside, the landlady had eyes that had seen more despair than daylight. Ruth? She echoed, like the name hurt to say. She's in room 4, keeps to herself, pays on time, doesn't sleep much. I thanked her, slipped a bill across the counter, and climbed the stairs that complained about every footstep. At the top, a narrow hallway waited, lined with peeling wallpaper and the smell of boiled fear. I knocked once, then again. The door opened just far enough for one terrified eye. Who sent you? She asked. I grinned. A man who never leaves his chair. Ruth Denham was the kind of girl fear chews on, but doesn't quite swallow. She looked 25, maybe less, with the eyes of someone twice that. Her hands fidgeted with a teacup that had seen better centuries. I can't talk, she said. The police already. Sure, I told her. But I'm not the police. I'm the man who gets yelled at by a genius for missing details. You'll like me better. That got half a smile. You shouldn't be here. Lady, I'm paid to be where I shouldn't. I kept my voice easy, light enough to make space for air. You mailed a letter before your employer died. Tell me about that. Her knuckles went white. I just followed instructions. A sealed envelope. I didn't read it. Who was it for? I can't. Try can. You'll feel better. She looked up then, eyes brimming but steady. It was addressed to Margaret Vale. That was enough to make me stop breathing for a beat. The fiancé. I kept my poker face and poured her more tea. You did fine, Ruth. You mailed it. Then what? I went home, she whispered. But after he died, I knew they'd blame me. Her story spilled like nervous ink. Uneven, blotched, but legible enough for Wolfe to read through me later. I saw him writing, she said. That evening, he used the same paper from his desk, the heavy kind, with the crest. He wrote for a long time, then sealed it. I mailed it before midnight. And the police? I asked. They came the next day, asked questions I didn't know how to answer. I told them about the letter, but they said no such envelope was found. So you ran. Her shoulders sagged. Wouldn't you? The lawyer said suicide, but I knew he wasn't that kind of man. I believed her, not because she looked honest, fear can fake that, but because her guilt wasn't rehearsed. When she finally met my eyes, there was something raw in them. If that letter had been found, she whispered, it would have cleared everything. Or burned everything down, I said. Either way, Wolfe was going to want it. Ruth poured me another cup of lukewarm tea, her version of hospitality, or maybe a stalling tactic. I set it down and noticed the teapot resting on a scrap of paper, as if protecting the table from its own stains. Old habit made me curious. I pulled it free with 2 fingers. Embossed crest, same grain, same faint watermark. Carrington House stationery. Mind if I keep this? I asked. She blinked. It's just paper. Sure, I said, slipping it into my pocket. And so's money, confessions, and forged suicide notes. That got her attention. She stared at me like I'd spoken the word murder. Did you? She started. No, I said. You just made me think faster. The match was perfect. Even Wolfe's orchids couldn't have produced such symmetry. The forged note Lydia had shown us was written on the same kind of sheet. Same texture, same thickness, same gilt woven into the pulp. Ruth sat very still, realizing she'd kept the only honest piece of evidence in a world of fakes. I glanced at my watch. Wolfe would be waiting. And when he waited, the world contracted to impatience. I found a diner 2 blocks away, the kind that serves caffeine strong enough to file patents. The phone booth in the corner smelled like old nickels and bad decisions. Wolfe answered on the second ring. Report. I gave him the short version. Ruth, the letter, the panic, the paper. He was silent for 10 seconds, which for Wolfe is the equivalent of standing on a cliff. Then he said, ink, paper, and motive all now require context. Meaning? Meaning the letter existed, therefore intent did too. A forgery demands forethought. Bring me the maid safely. She is the unwitting custodian of clarity. She's scared stiff, I said. If the wrong ears catch wind, then see she has a roof, Mr. Goodwin. Fear, like suspicion, is contagious. Fine, but she's not going to like me being her babysitter. Then employ tact. I hear it works on occasion. That was Wolfe, charm wrapped in insult. I hung up, dropped a dime for another coffee, and watched the street outside. Somewhere between 10th and 17th, a truth had gone missing, and I had the feeling I'd just touched the edge of it. The storm that afternoon came in a pinstripe suit and an expensive temper. Mr. Dalrymple didn't so much enter the brownstone as invade it, trailing the scent of litigation and pomade. Fritz, never fond of loud men before lunch, looked scandalized as I ushered him in. Wolfe, of course, didn't rise. He greeted the intrusion with the serenity of a Roman emperor watching barbarians scale the wall. Mr. Wolfe, Dalrymple began, voice polished to a threat. I'm here on behalf of the Carrington estate. Your involvement in private family matters is unwelcome. Wolfe lifted one eyebrow. You've come to ask that I abandon truth. To avoid scandal, Dalrymple said, and in the family's best interest. I leaned against the globe stand, enjoying the view of Wolfe's lip curling slightly, the signal that the game had begun. Sir, Wolfe replied, I am not governed by interests, familial or otherwise, only by facts. Dalrymple's jaw tightened. Then let me be plain. Withdraw. Wolfe reached for his beer. Your plainness is redundant. You have already revealed what you wish to conceal. Dalrymple blinked, and the thunder cracked. Dalrymple regrouped like a fencer pretending not to bleed. You misinterpret my concern, Mr. Wolfe. I am protecting reputations, not hiding guilt. Indeed, Wolfe said. And yet, you speak of protection before accusation. A curious order of priorities. Dalrymple's composure flickered. Your insinuations are intolerable. Then leave, Wolfe suggested mildly. But you won't, because you need to know what I know. I watched the lawyer stiffen, torn between retreat and curiosity. That's the problem with men who deal in half-truths. They always want to measure yours. What precisely do you think you know? He asked. That you fear a letter, Wolfe said. A letter whose disappearance you find convenient. Dalrymple's silence confirmed it. Wolfe pressed on. And that you visit under the pretense of legality to ensure I never find it. For a man who made his living on control, Dalrymple's breathing had gone uneven. You have no proof, he said finally. Not yet, Wolfe replied. But you've given me direction, and I rarely misplace those. Dalrymple turned for the door, every step rehearsed to look like dignity and failing. Wolfe murmured, Archie, when our guest departs, follow him. Dalrymple slammed the front door behind him, and the brownstone exhaled. Wolfe tilted his head toward me. He will not return home directly. Observe his deviation. Sure, I said. He doesn't look like the type to stop for candy. Wolfe grunted. Report within the hour. I grabbed my hat. You realize I'm starting to look like a private detective again. You'll ruin my reputation. He ignored me, which meant approval. Outside, the rain had turned slick and personal. Dalrymple's cab pulled off fast, and I hailed the next one. We slid through traffic like suspicion on wheels. The lawyer's destination wasn't the courthouse or any respectable club. He got out at Leland's, a bar that looked like it had once served gentlemen and now settled for defendants. I paid the driver, stayed a half block back, and thought about Wolfe sitting safe with his orchids while I risked pneumonia. Lawyers, I mused, never walk straight unless it's to the bank. And from the way Dalrymple glanced over his shoulder, I wasn't the only one who expected a payoff. Leland's bar was dim enough to make honesty difficult. The wallpaper had surrendered to nicotine years ago, and the jukebox wheezed a tune that didn't improve with clarity. Dalrymple took a booth near the back, ordered whiskey neat, and began waiting like a man who'd paid for trouble and wanted his receipt. 5 minutes later, Victor Carrington slid into the opposite seat. They spoke low, but I've been blessed with both patience and ears. From the next booth, half hidden behind a newspaper, I caught fragments, nervous, clipped, and dirty with implication. "The letter," Dalrymple began. Victor's tone cracked like glass. "If that letter is found, we're finished." Dalrymple hissed. "Lower your voice. Don't tell me what to... I'm telling you, survival depends on silence." There was a pause, long enough for guilt to breathe. Then Victor muttered, "Lydia's asking questions. She doesn't believe the suicide." Dalrymple's reply was ice. "Then she mustn't find proof." Chairs scraped. I kept still. They rose, exchanged curt nods, and split. Dalrymple for the door, Victor for the alley. I waited 30 seconds, heart steady, mind ticking. Wolfe would call this productive eavesdropping. I called it dangerous enlightenment. The payphone outside Leland's swallowed my dime and half my patience before Wolfe's baritone arrived. "Well," he said, "your favorite lawyer just met Victor Carrington at a bar that could give tuberculosis to the wallpaper." Conversation's short but juicy. "If that letter is found, we're finished." "Excellent," Wolfe said. "So the letter is not myth, but menace." "Yeah," I said. "And the lawyer's sweating ink. You want me to keep the tale?" "No. You have what I required. Confirmation and motive. Return." "Sure. Anything else while I'm drenched?" "Yes. Reflect on the irony that men spend fortunes concealing guilt when a simple confession would be cheaper." "That's comforting," I said. "I'll embroider it on my towel." His voice softened, which for Wolfe meant interest sharpened. "Archie, note the phrasing. We're finished. Plural. There is collusion. The letter must expose both." "Got it. Ink, paper, and panic, all pointing to the same desk." "Precisely. Come home." I hung up, the rain still punishing the pavement. Wolfe would be dry, smug, and ready to connect the dots. And me? I was starting to think the dots might spell out murder in capital letters. The morning began politely enough. Coffee, mail, and a rain that couldn't make up its mind. Then came the knock. It wasn't the kind that waits for an answer. It delivered something and fled. On the front step sat a newspaper-wrapped bundle, heavy for its size. Fritz brought it in like a bomb disguised as groceries. "Who left it?" Wolfe asked. "No one visible," I said, "unless the milkman's changed careers." He extended a finger. "Open it." I did. The paper fell away with the sound of damp confession, revealing a gleam I'd already memorized. The silver letter opener, lion crest, and all. Wolfe's eyebrows lifted a fraction. Returned trophies seldom arrive without motive. Maybe the killer felt generous. Or cornered. He leaned closer, studying the metal as if it had volunteered information. The lion stared back, tarnished, silent, proud. I could feel the air change. Wolfe was thinking in the deep gears now. Before I could speak, the doorbell rang again, sharp, urgent, human. He sighed. Providence, he murmured. It rarely knocks only once. It was Lydia Carrington, pale and trembling like the ghost of her own conscience. She clutched her gloves in both hands, eyes darting from the parcel to Wolfe, then back again. I brought it, she stammered. This morning. I deduced as much, Wolfe said mildly. Why? She swallowed. I took it that night. After they said he killed himself, I thought that it would condemn you, Wolfe finished for her. She nodded, tears threatening to undo what little dignity she'd preserved. I shouldn't have touched it, but I couldn't sleep, knowing it was in my drawer. I had to return it. Wolfe gestured toward the chair. Sit, Miss Carrington. Your fear, while misguided, may yet be instructive. I offered her a handkerchief, earning a fleeting smile that looked accidental. Fear, Wolfe said, is the only thief that steals from both the innocent and the guilty. Lydia pressed the cloth to her lips. I didn't mean to steal anything. No, Wolfe murmured, eyes half closed. You meant to survive. For a while, Wolfe said nothing. The silence gathered around him like authority wearing slippers. Lydia's breathing steadied in the quiet. Then he spoke. Miss Carrington, you did not steal. You preserved. She blinked. Preserved? The distinction is vital. A thief takes for gain. You acted from conscience, however clumsily. You removed an instrument that might have destroyed you. Preservation, not plunder. Lydia stared at him, the words untangling guilt she hadn't known how to name. You truly believe that? I believe logic, madam, not sentiment. In logic, your act aligns with integrity under duress. Her mouth trembled into something between relief and disbelief. You make it sound almost honorable. It was human, he said simply, and I do not condemn humanity for trembling in danger's shadow. That was Wolfe in his magnanimous mood, offering moral elevation with the same detachment he reserved for lunch. Lydia exhaled, a quiet surrender. Then what happens now? Before Wolfe could answer, Fritz appeared in the doorway, holding the letter opener delicately in a towel. Excuse me, Herr Wolfe, he said. Something inside. Fritz, immaculate even in alarm, extended the opener like a relic freshly exhumed. When I cleaned it, sir, I found this. He turned the handle slightly, and faint smears of blue glistened in the hollow seam. Wolfe took it, tilting it to the light. His eyes narrowed. Lexington blue. I whistled. So the lion's been drinking ink? Indeed, Wolfe said. Before it killed, it wrote. Lydia drew a sharp breath. You mean? Yes, Wolfe said. That this implement was used to prepare the false suicide note. The ink residue in the hollow indicates it served as a reservoir, an improvised pen for deceit. Fritz looked stricken. Then the weapon bore 2 deaths, Wolfe finished. One of flesh, one of truth. I watched Lydia's hand grip the armrest. The object she'd feared had just confessed louder than any witness. Dispose of nothing, Fritz, Wolfe ordered. We will preserve this lion as it preserved its ink, faithfully. Fritz nodded and withdrew. Wolfe set the opener on the desk between us, gleaming like irony given form. Archie, he said softly, the inanimate, when handled by fools, often speaks most clearly. And I had a feeling it was about to shout. Wolfe leaned back, studying the silver tool as though it were on trial. A lion that carried ink instead of blood, he mused. That is confession enough. I said, so it wasn't just a weapon, it was a writing implement. Precisely. Someone modified it to hold ink. A convenient concealment for forgery. Lydia looked stricken. Then the letter, the one Ruth mailed, was falsified, Wolfe said. Written with this very device. a forgery executed not by sentiment, but by intellect, perverted to deception. He traced a finger along the crest. Pride and deceit often share the same coat of arms. I asked, "You think Dalrymple or Victor used it?" Wolfe smiled faintly. "No, Archie. They merely profited by it. But the mind that filled this handle with ink also filled the house with death." Lydia shivered. "And the lion?" Wolfe's gaze remained, fixed. "It roared in silence, Miss Carrington. Until now." I looked at the opener, gleaming like the moral of a bad fable. Somewhere in its hollow, a secret had been written, and Wolfe was already composing its translation. Returning to Lexington House was like visiting a crime that had learned to whisper. The drizzle hadn't stopped since morning, and the mansion wore its gloom like old perfume, expensive, stale, impossible to forget. I told the butler I'd left a notebook during my last visit. He accepted that with the polite weariness of a man too tired to disbelieve. Inside, the air felt denser, as if the walls themselves had grown cautious. The servants moved like shadows rehearsing silence. Even the grandfather clock ticked with restraint. Victor was conveniently missing, and Margaret Vale greeted me with that brand of poise only the guilty or the perfectly trained possess. "You find what you came for, Mr. Goodwin?" she asked. "Not yet," I said, "but the day's young." She smiled, a porcelain curve that didn't reach her eyes. As I crossed the study, the familiar scent of Lexington blue ink lingered faintly, stubborn as a ghost, unwilling to quit the scene. Somewhere in that room, truth had been folded neatly and filed away. I just had to find which drawer it was hiding in. The late uncle's desk stood like an altar to dead intentions. Mahogany, polished within an inch of vanity, its surface told nothing. But habit made me curious, fingers tracing carved lions, grooves worn smooth by years of worry. One of them clicked, a sound too soft, too secret. I pressed again. A panel slid open with the hesitation of guilt being confessed. Behind it, a drawer no craftsman had ever admitted existed. Inside, an envelope, thick, yellowed, tied with a green ribbon. I didn't need Wolfe's eyebrows to guess what it was. I untied it carefully. The document inside bore a familiar heading: Last Will and Testament of Henry Carrington. The ink was faded, but the date, one day before his death, was fresh enough to sting. Unsigned? No, not quite. The signature was there, bold, deliberate, but lacking witnesses. Or so I thought, until I saw faint lines near the bottom, blurred by moisture. I folded it back, slid the drawer shut, and exhaled. If the dead could speak, this was their preferred method. In paper, not sound. And it was speaking loud. It wasn't till I looked again that I caught it. 2 faint names written in haste. One of them was unmistakable. Ruth Denham. The maid's confession had been truth after all. She hadn't imagined the letter or the will. She'd witnessed both, only to see them buried under forged ink and polite deceit. The second signature, unreadable, was Margaret's handwriting twisted by speed. I'd seen enough of her poised loops to know the tremor of conscience when it hit paper. The contents settled everything. The estate was to pass to a charitable foundation, with Margaret Vale as trustee. Victor, the golden heir, was nowhere in sight. That made the motive simple, human, and ugly. I folded the will and slipped it inside my coat. Wolfe would dissect it the way he dissected a steak, methodically, mercilessly. As I stepped out of the study, the hall felt colder, as if the house itself understood betrayal. Time to take the truth home to its keeper. By the time I made it back to the brownstone, the rain had gone from suggestion to sermon. Wolfe was in his chair, book discarded, eyes closed, as if awaiting an overdue confession. I laid the envelope on his desk. Souvenir from Lexington House, hidden drawer, fresh ink, and more hypocrisy per square inch than a Senate hearing. He opened it with the reverence he usually reserved for vintage sausages. His lips thinned as he read. Dalrymple, he said finally. He buried this document with forgery, a suicide note to nullify a testament. Meaning Victor wasn't heir, just accessory. Precisely. Dalrymple forged death to forge inheritance, an elegant corruption. Fritz arrived with onion tarts and 2 cold bottles of beer. Wolfe accepted both. Deduction, like appetite, required fuel. As he chewed thoughtfully, he murmured, "Deception rarely hides beneath violence. It prefers etiquette." I grinned. "You planning to serve the truth with mustard or cold?" He ignored me, eyes fixed on the will. "Archie, the ink that wrote this lie was not confined to one pen." And that sounded exactly like the start of trouble. Wolfe's silence stretched longer than usual. He poured himself another beer with the concentration of a man considering sin. "There is," he said finally, "one element of imbalance." "Besides the corpses and perjury?" I asked. "Knowledge," he said. "It rarely travels alone. Someone besides Dalrymple and the maid must have known of the testament." "Victor?" "No. He lacked subtlety. Margaret, perhaps. Yes, but not in full measure. There's a shadow yet unplaced." I leaned back. "You think someone else handled the will?" "Perhaps only its idea. Knowledge unattended, Archie, becomes temptation. That temptation kills more efficiently than poison." He set down his glass, eyes half-lidded. "We must find who else knew and why they did nothing. That's a wide field, boss. Then we shall mow it." The room felt smaller suddenly. The will, the ink, the lion, each piece closing in like polite predators. Wolfe tapped the desk lightly. "Prepare, Archie. Our caller will arrive soon." I frowned. "Caller?" He smiled, faint and satisfied. "Yes, the one who cannot sleep with knowledge alone." And right then I heard the doorbell ring. The brownstone had a way of resetting its pulse after every storm. I found Wolfe upstairs among the orchids, cocooned in humid quiet, while New York kept grinding its teeth outside. The air was thick enough to drown impatience, mine included. Rows of orchids glowed under. The lamps, each petal glistening like it had just been born and already knew it was superior. Wolfe stood between them, an emperor in shirt sleeves, pruning shears in hand, serenity stitched into every motion. It irritated me, that calm. The case still buzzed in my head. Forged wills, blue ink, and a lion that lied. And here he was, counting blossoms. "You ever consider that murderers don't stop for horticulture?" I asked. "An observation as shallow as it is accurate," he said without turning. "That was Wolfe for you, trimming death from the world one orchid at a time, while the rest of us mopped up what was left." I leaned against the bench, watching him adjust a mist nozzle like it held the meaning of life. "You planning to talk about Carrington, or just water your way to enlightenment?" "The latter would be preferable," he murmured. He clipped a withered stem with surgical precision. "Growth, Archie, demands discipline. Remove one weakness, and the structure survives. Neglect it, and decay spreads." "Nice sermon," I said. "You giving that to the DA or just your begonias?" He sighed. "Metaphor, not sermon, though I concede the distinction eludes most ears." The orchids seemed to listen better than I did. Their silence, at least, was respectful. I drummed my fingers on a pot. "So we're not discussing murder." He turned, one eyebrow lifted. "We are, merely through a more civilized lens." I should have known better than to rush him. Patience was his favorite form of punishment. When he finally spoke again, it was in that tone he reserves for delivering verdicts no one asked for. "Men will die not for money, but for acknowledgement." I looked up. "Money usually buys acknowledgement. That's why people prefer it." Wolfe shook his head. "Nonsense. Money is merely acknowledgement's certificate. Pride signs it. Vanity cashes it." He returned to his plants, letting the words hang like the scent of fertilizer. I said, So you're telling me all this ink and inheritance business was about pride, not greed? Greed is crude, he said. It devours. Pride refines. It persuades men to decorate their crimes with justification. That was Wolfe's way of making sin sound like a profession. I considered it. Guess that explains Dalrymple's little forgery hobby. Wolfe's lips twitched. He wrote deceit for recognition, not profit. A subtler distinction than you credit. I didn't argue. I just filed it under. Philosophy. Wolfe's brand. He moved to the next row of orchids, mist curling around him like thought made visible. Each of them hungered for acknowledgement, he said softly. Victor, for legitimacy. Margaret, for moral authority. Lydia, for absolution. Sounds poetic, I said. Almost human. It is human, he replied. Recognition, Archie, is the final narcotic. Deny it, and a man will invent virtue to disguise his craving. I had to admit it. Had bite. So what? This whole mess was just a bunch of egos starving for applause. Not starving, he said. Performing. The orchids gleamed, each one preening under the lamps. Performers in their own right. I muttered, "You could have told me that before I tailed half of Manhattan." He smiled faintly. "You required the exercise." It wasn't deduction anymore. It was reflection wearing a detective's suit. And damn it, it fit. Wolfe reached for a final bloom, trimmed it neatly, and examined the stem. "Growth requires both cut and consequence," he murmured. Then, almost to himself, "Who sought acknowledgement?" It wasn't really a question, more like a sentence waiting for its subject. The air seemed to tighten around it. I opened my mouth, then closed it. There was no need to answer. The silence said enough. Wolfe set the shears down, eyes distant but alert. "The one who needed recognition most," he said, "is the one who believed they'd earned it." I didn't press for names. He'd deliver them when the bloom was ready. Somewhere below, the phone began to ring. And just like that, the still air started moving again. By the time I reached Lexington Avenue, the night had turned orange. The Carrington mansion, that prim showcase of old money and new lies, was burning like it had finally decided to confess. Flames clawed the facade, licking the stone lions as if reclaiming them for hell's decor. The crowd was already gathered, bathrobes, umbrellas, and gossip. A cop waved me back. "Private property," he said. "Not for long," I told him, and ducked past before he could argue. Smoke poured from the windows like the house was exhaling guilt. Somewhere inside, wood cracked, glass screamed, and a chandelier made its final curtain call. I ran through the main doors, half expecting the place to spit me out. Instead, the grand staircase sagged like an old man's spine, leading me toward the study, the heart of this whole rotten anatomy. Every step burned through the soles of my shoes, but Wolfe's voice was still in my head. "Observe, Archie. Even in chaos, there is pattern." Pattern or not, the fire was winning, and if anyone was still alive inside, they were running out of both time and air. The corridor felt endless, lined with smoke that moved like thought, uncertain, suffocating, and too hot for logic. I found Lydia near the stairwell, half collapsed, clutching a pillowcase as if it held her soul. "Miss Carrington," I yelled, dragging her upright. She coughed hard enough to make my ribs ache in sympathy. "We're leaving," I told her. "No," she gasped. "Victor, he tried to stop it." The rest drowned in another coughing fit. I slung her arm around my shoulder and pushed forward. Behind us, a section of the ceiling groaned like a dying conscience and gave way. We reached the foyer as the smoke turned solid. Someone shouted my name. A firefighter. Maybe, or my better judgment. I dropped Lydia into waiting hands, then turned back. The study door was half open, and through the heat shimmer I saw Victor sprawled beside the desk. His face was calm in a way that only the dead manage. The fire had written its own verdict. By the time I stumbled outside, the house had started to fold in on itself. Lydia's whisper lingered in my ears, thin as smoke. He tried to stop it. And maybe, in his way, He had. At 2 in the morning, the only thing louder than my lungs was the telephone crackle. "Wolfe," I said. "Lexington house is gone. Fire. Big one. Lydia's alive. Barely. Victor's finished." Silence. Then his voice, calm, clipped, as if I'd just reported a late shipment of beer. "Describe the origin." "Looked like the study," I said. "Started fast, too fast. Gasoline, maybe." A pause. "No," he said. "It was not to destroy the house, but a piece of paper." That was Wolfe. The man could translate chaos into motive before the ashes cooled. "You mean the will?" "I mean the lie that replaced it." His tone was soft, but it had weight, the kind that drops only when the truth is about to surface. "I'll be there in an hour," I said. "Don't," he replied. "Stay with the ashes. They will tell me more than witnesses ever could." And with that, the line went dead, like everything else that night. By dawn, the fire was just memory and steam. The ruins of Lexington House looked like guilt carved in charcoal. I joined the fire chief and a couple of uniformed men poking through the debris of what used to be civilization's best furniture. In the study, or what was left of it, a metal lockbox had half melted into the floorboards. Inside, they found what Wolfe had predicted: paper, scorched but stubborn. The suicide note. The edges were burned to lace, the ink blurred into grey veins. But the signature, neat, deliberate, had survived untouched. It looked smug, like forgery immune to flame. "Looks genuine," one of the cops muttered. "Too genuine," I said. They gave me a look, but I'd seen Wolfe's kind of irony before. Fire can't destroy truth. It just edits it. I folded the remnant carefully into an envelope. Somewhere, Wolfe was probably slicing another tomato, waiting for this precise confirmation. The note had burned, yes, but the lie it carried had died harder. And now, even the ashes had started whispering his name. By the time Wolfe read my report, the sun was up, and the world smelled of damp soot and moral exhaustion. He listened, fingers steepled, expression unreadable. When I finished, he nodded once. "Victor Carrington set the fire," he said. "Not in madness, in despair." I frowned. "You're sure?" "I am." He discovered his guilt was written in ink that could not be erased. The forgery, the manipulation, the loss of dignity, all intolerable to a man whose pride exceeded his virtue. "So, he burned it," I said. "House, papers, maybe his conscience." "Precisely." Wolfe leaned back. "A final act of order. Annihilation as restoration." I stared at him. "That's a poetic way of saying he killed himself." "Not killed," Wolfe corrected. "Cleansed." Outside I could still smell the smoke from Lexington Avenue, thin and sour. Maybe Wolfe was right. Maybe the fire was confession disguised as destruction. But standing there, watching the morning haze settle over the city, I couldn't help thinking, some sins don't burn away. They just change colour. When Wolfe asks for breakfast to be extended to guests, it's never about hospitality. It's ceremony, the kind that precedes verdicts. Fritz had outdone himself. Eggs scrambled to a silk finish, coffee dark enough to drown nerves, and the table gleaming like conscience pretending to be clean. Margaret Vale sat rigid at one end, dressed in mourning shades that matched her control. Lydia looked pale but steady, hands folded like she was praying for quiet, not forgiveness. Inspector Kramer was there too, already frowning at the silverware as if it might testify. Wolfe ate in silence, methodically, fork to mouth, fork to thought. The orchids glowed faintly from the window shelf, the only things in the room allowed to breathe freely. "Archie," he said finally, "be sure no one leaves." That was Wolfe's version of a preamble, my cue to lean against the wall and keep my eyes open while the polite thunder gathered. Breakfast, in that room, wasn't a meal. It was an ambush served hot, and by the look in Margaret's eyes, she could already taste the poison of her own making. Wolfe dabbed his lips with his napkin, his signal that the game had begun. "Mrs. Vale," he said gently. "Miss Carrington. Inspector. Each of you witnessed the fire's aftermath. Before I comment, I would hear your impressions. It sounded innocent enough, but I'd seen that tone carve stone." Margaret's voice was smooth, a practiced composition of grief and intellect. The fire was a tragedy. Victor was overcome by guilt. "Indeed," Wolfe said mildly. "Miss Carrington," Lydia's words trembled. "He tried to stop it. He wanted to confess." Kramer snorted. "He confessed all right. To a blaze." Wolfe's eyes didn't leave Margaret's face. And yet no one seems curious why a suicide note was written with an ink no longer manufactured. That made her blink. Once. I watched Wolfe tally every twitch, every hesitation. He didn't need confessions. Human nature was a louder witness. He refilled his cup with calm precision. "The truth, ladies and gentlemen, is rather like coffee. It must be brewed, not declared." And from the stillness that followed, I knew the heat was only beginning. Wolfe turned slightly in his chair and nodded at me. I fetched the small mahogany box from his desk, the kind that usually held cigars, but now contained something far more combustible. He opened it with a delicate motion. Inside were 2 glass vials. "Ink," he announced, as if unveiling a relic. "One from the suicide note, the other from Mrs. Vale's personal stationery. Miss Carrington, you will observe." Margaret's lips parted. "Surely this is absurd." Wolfe ignored her. He held both samples under his magnifier. The tint known as Lexington blue, faintly indigo with metallic undertones, a formula discontinued 7 years ago. He raised one eyebrow. "Except, of course, for private commissions, such as those ordered by Vale Foundation stationery suppliers, whose receipts I now possess." Margaret's fork clinked against her plate. A small sound, but the sound of something cracking. Wolfe continued softly. "The forged note and your monogrammed letters, madam, were written from the same well of deceit. Quite literally." I caught Kramer's eye. Even he looked impressed. Margaret's fingers tightened around her coffee cup. She didn't drink. And Wolfe, savouring silence the way others savour dessert, let the proof settle like smoke. "The sequence," Wolfe began, "is simple. Mr. Dalrymple composed the forgery at your instruction, Mrs. Vale. You required Victor's ruin to secure your own ascendancy." Margaret's voice was brittle. "You presume too much." "I presume nothing," Wolfe said. "You were not content to administer the foundation. You wished to own its virtue, and to possess Victor's dependence as the currency of your moral authority." She tried to laugh. It came out like glass-scraping porcelain. Wolfe pressed on. "You arranged the forged note to feign suicide, trusting pity to silence suspicion. You buried the real will, ensuring your trusteeship remained intact. The fire was an accident of despair, Victor's belated rebellion against your perfection. I've seen Wolfe flay liars before, but never so quietly." Every word peeled another layer from her self-control. Kramer folded his arms. "That about nails it." Margaret's eyes darted toward the window. Not escape, just the instinct of cornered pride. Wolfe adjusted his napkin. "Your greatest miscalculation, madam, was believing morality and manipulation could coexist. They cannot. You forged one to justify the other." She inhaled sharply, colour draining, and that, in Wolfe's world, was as good as a confession. Margaret straightened, chin trembling but high. "You have no proof," she said, "only conjecture dressed as intellect." Wolfe's eyes closed briefly, the way a lion might before deciding whether to pounce. "Madam," he said, "conjecture is the art of thought preceding proof. You, however, mistake both for conscience." The silence that followed was surgical. Even Fritz, listening from the kitchen doorway, seemed to hold his breath. She rose halfway from her chair, then sat again. "You think yourself above judgment." "I do." Wolfe said calmly. Because I require none. Her voice faltered. You can't prove I ordered that forgery. No, he said, but you have already proven it, by surviving it. She went still, eyes fixed on him, and in that stillness her guilt became visible, tangible, almost weary. Kramer stepped forward, but Wolfe raised a hand. Let her be. The truth has already arrested her. He turned to me. Archie, record the time. Breakfast concluded. The room exhaled at once. Lydia wept quietly. The coffee had gone cold, untouched. And I thought, not for the first time, that Wolfe's justice never needed a courtroom. Only a table, a mind, and silence sharp enough to cut through denial. It didn't happen with tears or dramatics. Margaret Vale wasn't built for that. Her composure cracked the way fine porcelain does, soundlessly, until you noticed the fracture ran deep. I forged it, she said finally, her voice as precise as the lie had been. For the good of the family, for stability, for reputation. Her words climbed toward nobility, but lost footing halfway. I'd seen that tone before. People trying to convince themselves that sin comes pre-packaged with purpose. Wolfe didn't move. He merely watched her, the stillness of a mind finishing its equation. You understand, she pressed on. Victor was weak. The foundation would have collapsed under scandal. I acted out of duty. Kramer grunted. You acted out of fear, lady. She ignored him. It was necessary. Wolfe's eyelids lowered. Ah, he murmured. Necessity, the perennial sanctuary of the self-deceived. Margaret flinched as though he'd touched her. Pride wrestled with guilt, and both lost. Her confession hung between us, not repentance, but rationalization, dressed in black silk. And in that silence, you could hear the echo of every lie ever told, for someone's good. Wolfe let the quiet stretch, then spoke as if addressing the air itself. There is no virtue in deceit, he said, only competence or failure. You, madam, were merely competent. Margaret stared at him. You think morality is arithmetic? Indeed, he replied, addition and subtraction of truth. Most people miscalculate. That was Wolfe, stripping morality of its velvet, leaving it bare as logic. You played saviour, he continued, but salvation is not forged in ink. It is earned in honesty, a currency you decline to use. Her eyes hardened. You judge too easily. I do not judge, he said coldly. I classify. That landed harder than a sermon. Margaret rose halfway, trembling between outrage and collapse. Wolfe remained immovable, a mountain with manners. Kramer's pencil scratched across his pad. Lydia turned away, silent. Wolfe's verdict wasn't cruelty. It was anatomy, dissection of vanity, nerve by nerve. And when Margaret finally sat again, I could almost hear the weight of intellect settling on her like a sentence that required no court. After Margaret was escorted out, delicately, like a damaged statue, Lydia lingered near the door. Her face had the kind of exhaustion only truth can cause. Mr. Wolfe, she said softly, you've given my uncle his honour back. He looked up from his empty coffee cup. I restore facts, Miss Carrington, not honour. That you supply yourself. She tried to smile. Still, thank you. He nodded once. If gratitude must be expressed, direct it to Mr. Goodwin. I merely applied method. That was Wolfe's way of declining applause. And money too, as it turned out. When she offered the envelope, he waved it off. Lexington House has paid enough. Fritz appeared with quiet timing, collecting plates as if gathering the remnants of sin. Lydia's eyes glistened, but she said nothing more. She only bowed her head slightly, not to him perhaps, but to what the morning had proven possible. The air felt cleaner, or maybe just quieter. When the door finally shut behind Lydia, Wolfe leaned back in his chair, eyes drifting toward the orchids as if the entire case had been an interruption to chlorophyll. I stacked my notebook, feeling the weight of the last few days slide off like smoke. You know, I said, you could charge more for turning crime into philosophy. Plenty of guilty souls would pay for the sermon. He grunted. Philosophy is unprofitable. Its only reward is the avoidance of stupidity. That, I said, and a reputation for solving the unsolvable. He ignored me, which meant I was right. Sometimes, watching him, I wondered how much of his intellect was curiosity and how much was disgust with human error. He never said. Funny thing, I added. The grandest crimes always start small, a vanity here, a fear there. He glanced at me briefly. That is because the seed of corruption is rarely large enough to notice before it flowers. And just like that, we were back to orchids again. The house settled into its afternoon rhythm. Fritz in the kitchen, the city droning beyond the curtains, and Wolfe already absorbed in his orchids as if the world had finally regained balance. He adjusted a stem, spoke almost absently. The craving for justice, Archie, is often vanity dressed in mourning. I looked up from my notes. You saying we only chase justice because we like the reflection? Not we, he corrected. They, the multitude who demand righteousness so they may admire their own indignation. That was Wolfe, handing down truth like a fine but bitter wine. I let it sink in, then muttered, "And what about you?" He smiled faintly. "I, sir, am indifferent to reflections. They distort the orchid's colour." He turned back to the flowers, their pale petals trembling under the light. For a moment, the case, the lies, the fire, the vanity, all felt distant, reduced to one quiet truth. Even victory in Wolfe's world comes trimmed with melancholy. And somehow, that felt just right. In the quiet after confession, justice did not thunder. It merely exhaled. The lies had burned away, leaving only ashes of pride and the faint perfume of truth. Wolfe returned to his orchids, where deceit could not grow, and I wondered if intellect alone ever mends what vanity destroys. What do you think? Was Margaret Vale driven by love, or by the hunger to be seen as right? Let me know your thoughts in the comments. And if you enjoyed the mystery, be sure to like the video, share it with someone who loves detective stories, and subscribe for more. Not every case ends with applause, but the truth, once found, always echoes.